Before we get to this week's episode, I'd like to remind you all that my book, The Anxious Person's Guide to Non-Monogamy, is available through most major bookstores. It would be lovely if you would purchase it through the Jessica Kingsley Publishers website. Just do a little Google. It's a great book for people brand new to non-monogamy or people who have tried it for a while and need a little bit more structure. You can head to nonmonogamyhelp.com/book for more details and to show an interest in the audiobook, which would be really, really helpful to me. If you've bought it and read it, please give it a rating or review on Amazon. If you don't mind, that's also very helpful. Thank you so much for your support. Let's get to this week's episode.
Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 91 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. If you would like to ask me a question on the column or on the podcast, please feel free to email nonmonogamyhelp@gmail.com and I'll either read the letter in the podcast or in the column. You're more than welcome to let me know which one you'd rather me do. If you want to read the columns in the podcast, you can find everything at nonmonogamyhelp.com along with my 101 and 102 articles. You can subscribe to the email newsletter and get everything in your inbox a few days before it goes live by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at nonmonogamyhelp. If there's something you want to do to help out the podcast and the columns a little bit more, becoming a patron is amazing. You can get I think you can still do it for a whole year and get a month for free or something like that. You can do that by going to patreon.com/Lola Phoenix. It's really, really, really appreciated even. Look, I can speak. I am a true podcaster. And if you donate $5 or more a month, your name, with your permission, will be read at the end of the podcast, just as a thanks. Let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first time you're hearing an episode, welcome. Every week I have a discussion question where I basically ask a question that you can use with your friends, metamors, anyone you want to get to know a little bit better. And I also answer it myself briefly to give just a little bit of context. This week's discussion question is, what is your definition of ethical within the confines of relationships? I think this is really interesting because I have many times, if you've not listened to all the podcasts or read the columns, said that I really dislike the term ethical non-monogamy, mostly because I feel like non-monogamy is inherently ethical, and if you're not doing something ethical, then you're probably cheating, so I dislike it. It's kind of, to me, like saying non-drowning swimming. I don't like it. And I also kind of feel like what is ethical about non-monogamy tends to be about all parties being at least somewhat aware that non-monogamy is afoot. Technically, there are lots of things that people don't consider quote-unquote ethical, which I think are actually ethical because all parties are informed. So for me, on a very basic level, ethical within relationships means that everybody is informed. And if they're not informed, then in my opinion, it's not ethical. However, I understand that ethics has a wider definition and there's lots of different things to consider when it comes to that. But in terms of just not passing judgment on people, how they do their lives, on a very basic level, that's how I define ethics when it comes to relationships. Right? That's this week's discussion question. Let me repeat it. What is your definition of ethical within the confines of relationships? Let's get to this week's question. Is there anything inherently wrong in a hierarchical polyam structure? A lot of the sources I've listened and read seem to favor anarchical, but my partner and I are married, have been together for 6 years, and have agreed upon being each other's primary. We know being married doesn't guarantee that we stay together any more than a domestic partnership, but for us, being married means that we'll try and work problems out before ever considering leaving. It means we don't want to imagine life without each other in some way. I want more casual relationships while he requires more mental/emotional connection, so maybe what we're doing is more than just being open than polyam, but I figured polyam was the correct term. Before we get to this week's answer, I'm going to quickly plug this episode's sponsor, BetterHelp. I tend to recommend that people see a polyamory-friendly therapist, and in general, I just think most people should see a therapist. You don't have to be quote-unquote sick to see a therapist. Therapy is really, really good, and it's something that really, really helps a lot of people, so please consider it if you haven't. And definitely if you're going through a rough time, then BetterHelp might be an option for you. For a lot of people, looking locally for a therapist is just not possible if they want someone who understands and not pathologizes polyamory, and it might be out of your budget, whereas BetterHelp allows you to find therapists online. You can send messages to, you can switch therapists, and they do offer some financial aid. You can get 10% off your first month by using the promo code Non-Monogamy Help or going to betterhelp.com/non-monogamy help. Let's get to this week's answer. I think that there are people within the polyam community who basically feel like hierarchy is inherently unethical. And just as I said when it comes to the question that started this episode, the discussion question, ethics is a complicated thing, and people use it to mean a lot of different things. In my opinion, what makes something ethical is that all parties are informed. So if you have a what's called a don't ask, don't tell relationship, technically, in my opinion, that is an ethical relationship, because even though the rule is that one partner probably has other relationships and one other partner isn't informed about those relationships, at the very least, that other partner has been informed that there will be other relationships. So they are in some way informed in a way that somebody who keeps relationships hidden is not informing their partner. Some people would say don't ask, don't tell is always unethical to them, because their standard of ethics is that not only do people inform and consent to non-monogamy, but they also know their partners and know everybody and don't feel like they have to hide things. Some people feel like if there's any situation where they would have to hide or pretend like they aren't dating their partner, that would feel very unethical to them. And I think that that's valid. I think both of those approaches are very valid. I can understand why people feel like a hierarchy where you have a primary partner is unethical. And I think from my experience, and maybe I'm wrong, there's probably a lot of different experiences people have, but that probably stems from the fact that there are a lot of people who practice a hierarchical structure where they do treat other people outside of that structure as disposable. And probably a lot of people have been burned by that, myself included. Though the person who burned me wasn't really in a hierarchical polyamorous relationship, they were monogamous and they just neglected to tell me. Anyway, I won't get into that. The point is that I feel like this is where a lot of people have been burned. And I think the assumption is that if somebody is quote unquote anarchical in their practice of polyamory, it means that they shouldn't value one relationship over the other, even friendships or anything like that. However, whether that is how people actually practice is arguable. Just because someone says that they're not hierarchical doesn't mean that's how they behave. For me, I think if you're going to have a structure where you have a primary partner, there are two main things to consider. The first thing to consider is that when you create a MVP position, and that's what this is, that you have created, this is the most important person. This is a VIP, MVP, whatever you want to call it. That in and of itself will induce some anxiety in the relationship. And the reason is that if somebody is put on a pedestal, if there is one position in your partner's heart for most important partner, it makes total sense for your brain to worry about being kicked off of your throne. So understand that as much as you might feel that a primary partnership is quote unquote safer, I have seen that for some people, it creates more of fear of loss. It creates more of a fear of competition. it creates more anxiety and doesn't, in fact, make them feel safer. Also, I'd say as an addendum onto type of that type of consideration. Actually, maybe there are 3 considerations and this is a second. Especially because you are married and you live together. One thing that I have personally found is that when you are married and living with someone, as much as people say that you have some type of privilege over quote unquote secondary partners, my personal experience is that having to live with someone and share that type of life means that you get the good, the bad, and the ugly. You fight about money. You fight about housework. You fight about this or that. Maybe not like fight, but like there are a lot more reasons for you to have disagreements, and there are a lot more compromising things that you have to do when you share a space with someone than when you don't. There are a lot more opportunities for disagreement and frustration in a life where you share something with someone to that extent than when you don't. And I would not be surprised to find out many people who are the quote-unquote primary and who are supposedly in a better off position who feel like they're being neglected, to be blunt. They're being not cared for or not able to have the benefits, not even benefits. Basically, secondary quote-unquote partners, sometimes it feels like they get all the fun bits of the person that you're dating, whereas you have to deal with all the negative things. They get to go out on dates, they get to have fun, they don't have to worry about bills, they don't have to worry about childcare. Like, it can very much feel like you are the work partner and they're the fun partner. And that can be really hard to deal with. It takes work and effort for someone who is monogamous within a long-term monogamous marriage to keep that connection alive, because there's so much about the way we live our lives now that creates stress, that creates a lot of time suck, basically. We don't have a lot of time to spend in fun relationship stuff because we have so much other shit to do. And so if it already takes a lot of effort to keep monogamy kind of going and to put effort into that relationship, then not only does your partner have to put effort into your relationship, but they also are putting effort into other people's relationships. And it's very easy, especially with new relationship energy and people being exciting and shiny and new, to end up with a partner who spends a lot of time impressing other people and basically just takes you for granted. And that may be more of my personal experience shining through. But I do want to have you consider that as a thing. And you might actually have that experience, because if that's what you've been doing, then you probably might have already run across that. But that is something that I think people considering a type of primary hierarchy should think about. And you will run across a lot of criticism of it because, there is the assumption, because of monogamous culture, that a couple that's married is doing what you're doing, like they're preserving their relationship at all costs to others. And that is a fair critique, and I don't think that's something that's unfair or not true. I think that there's lots and lots of cases, especially people new to polyamory, who have been in marriages for a long time and who probably will save that marriage over any other relationship because they've invested more time, because they share children, because they share housing. There's lots of different reasons why they would do that, so it gets that fair critique. But I do think that there's very little, in my opinion, of a way of discussing how difficult it can be to be the quote-unquote primary and see a partner invest time into other relationships that they don't invest in you, because the assumption is that you live together, you're a safe option, you are always going to be there, and so there is less of a reason to focus on you than there is on new people. And I think that the last thing that I think is also worth considering if you go about this type of structure is consent and informed consent. Where I have read and advised on stories where people have been burned by couples who are prioritizing their own relationship in front of others, generally speaking, it has been because there has been a lack of informed consent on the side of the couple. And it's because they haven't been truly honest. Most of the time, sometimes because they're just new to polyamory and they don't really understand or know what it is they're going about. But I think that if you are going to prioritize your marriage over other relationships, both you and your partner should be 100% honest with anybody that you date about that priority. Don't hide it. You may get a little shit from it from people who think that you're just being mean or unethical or whatever, but it's better for you to be fully honest about that. And so every single person who dates you or your partner 100% knows what they're getting into and can make their own informed decision about whether or not they decide to engage with you past that information. Now, there may be people who, kind of ignore their own boundaries, who decide that they want to take a risk and invest in you, and then something happens and you decide to end that relationship and they get burned anyway. That still may happen, but I feel like part of that is also giving informed consent to that person and just say, this is a hierarchical structure. And I also think, as an attachment to this, understanding what this means for how your relationship will exist in the future will also help. So yes, you're each other's primary. And understandably, you are going to probably want to preserve the marriage over other things. If non-monogamy isn't something that ends up working, then you're probably going to want to return to monogamy, potentially. However, I think a big part of the reason why couples like this open and then close and try to dip their toe into non-monogamy, and then something happens and they decide to basically chuck other people out like a, defunct work core to save a major ship. Sorry to be a nerd. I think that mostly that comes from not understanding how non-monogamy is meant to fit into their marriage and thinking that they can go about non-monogamy in a way that won't mean that they spend less time together or won't feel threatening to their relationship. And I don't think that that's the case. So not only do you need to be informing people of your hierarchical structure, but I also think that you need to understand what actual positions there are available in your life. If you and your partner were to have, let's say, one other partner, how would that fit into your day-to-day activities? How would that fit into your life? It's much easier to, as a person, agree to be a quote-unquote secondary, if you want to call that, if I understand what being a quote-unquote secondary means. And likewise, if you and your partner agree, okay, we'll have, you want more casual relationships, so I will have dates on Friday, and that'll be my date night, and I might spend the night at somebody's house, but that'll be the only night I spend at somebody's house. And then maybe your partner has more of a mental and emotional connection, so maybe he talks to people all throughout the day, maybe goes on coffee dates, and then maybe he on Friday goes on bigger dates. But the agreement is that, when you're eating dinner together, he's there only for you, and, there's no communication with anybody else. And you both have agreed date nights yourself, and you agree on childcare if there's children involved, or anything like that. So once you understand what your life looks like in non-monogamy or polyamory or whatever you want to call it, then it becomes much easier to, when you're on a date with somebody, be like, so this is my structure, this is what I'm looking for. I'm not really looking for someone who wants a quote-unquote primary. I'm looking for something more casual, and then you don't waste your time, and the other person doesn't waste their time getting invested, getting emotionally hooked on one another when you are inherently incompatible. Because I think that sometimes it's about incompatibility and not necessarily that you are evil for having a hierarchy, but that you want something specific, and people who are looking for more of an emotional investment or maybe want anchor partners themselves may not be the best people for you to date in the long term. Maybe you have a hookup, but you see what I'm saying? Like, the more you have an idea of what it is that you're looking for, where the puzzle piece fits, then you won't waste your time trying to jam a piece that doesn't fit, and that piece that doesn't fit won't get all janky. And last but not least, I think that there is something to consider with this. And I think that there needs to be some discussion amongst the two of you about veto power and what that means. There is a lot of shit about how veto is wrong, how it should never be allowed, about how it's unethical. And me personally, I think a veto is a band-aid on a gaping wound. Likewise, I feel very much the same about people who open their relationships and then try to close them when it quote-unquote doesn't work. And that's because two things. One, people have an expectation that polyamory or non-monogamy will make them happy. And when they start doing non-monogamy and they start experiencing negative emotions, they get freaked out. Sometimes they think that they aren't non-monogamous enough, or they're freaked out by their partner dating somebody else and they don't know how to deal with it, so they close the relationship to presumably bring them back to a type of stasis that calms them, and then they're less freaked out. And then the second thing, I think, is the assumption that their close relationship is safer, and it does feel safer to them, obviously, because this is a big change. Think of it in comparison to, like, moving to a new town or you know, something like that. It probably does feel safer in some instances. Just move back when you're struggling and when and something isn't going exactly the way that you plan. And people don't have a roadmap within non-monogamy, and they don't sometimes have an example of it, and it's a completely new idea for some people, and they're not used to it, and they don't really remember what it was like to have their first relationships in monogamy where they were just as stressed out. But at least they had that cultural backing of, like, this is something that definitely works. So understandably, there's a lot of bit of a panic there, and then they get freaked out, they shut it, and I think that equally when you veto somebody, if what you want is for your partner to pay attention to you, if you're vetoing because your partner isn't paying enough attention to you or there's something going wrong, the mistake you're making there is that the other person is the cause of that, and getting rid of them will solve that. And it's not true. I understand why people use vetoes. I'm not really here to judge or attack anybody who uses a veto, because I get it. I get that they're panicked, and sometimes it does actually cause somebody to pay more attention to them, or to, you know, it's a shock, and then they focus on their relationship and improve it. But generally, on the whole, I think that it's far better and far more sustainable for you to try and, if your partner isn't working with you to fix the problem, then that's an issue that's going to be there whether your relationship is open or not. But it's more sustainable for you to address the actual cause of the problem. Vetoes and things like that are not treating, they're treating the symptom and not the disease, if that makes sense. So when you talk about how you're going to try and work out problems before considering leaving, even if I knew someone who was monogamous who felt that way, I would probably challenge them on that. And I'm not saying that you can't want to be in a relationship that you've been in for a long time, but I do think that when you get to a point where staying in a relationship is more important than anything, to me that's a little bit worrying, whether or not somebody is in an open relationship or not, or whether or not someone is monogamous or polyamorous. I think that primarily you both should be more interested in a successful relationship with yourself than necessarily always preserving the marriage. And I get what you're saying. I don't think that you're saying that you're just going to stay together no matter how unhappy you are together. I get what you're saying. You're just saying that you're going to try and work out problems. But I don't think that that's a function of hierarchy, because if there's a problem within your relationships, or if there's a problem within your relationship as a couple, then getting rid of other people isn't necessarily going to fix the problem within your relationship. And I think you need to question your attitude towards what this means when it comes to other people, because it is fucked up and cruel and mean to decide that, in the same way, friendship, like it's also, think of it this way: if you decided that because you're married, your partner should care more about you than they do their friends, and you will preserve your marriage over any friendship your partner has or any friendship you have, and you take that attitude toward it, it's a very weird attitude to take towards friends. And almost we would kind of see someone who expects their partner to get rid of friends they don't like as, if not abusive, then going down that route. And I'm not saying that this is an abusive approach that you're taking, but what I'm saying is to be so explicit in the idea that other people are a threat and there is only safety within your relationship is maybe a different concept that isn't necessarily accurate. I'm not saying there aren't people who, there's a concept called cowgirling or cowboying, where someone pretends to be non-monogamous, but their point is really to extricate someone from their partner and establish a monogamous relationship with them. That probably does exist. However, if you are strong as a couple, as two people together, then you're strong as a couple. And I think that someone else trying to quote unquote steal your partner, it's a very similar idea of that. When your partner is responsible for their behavior, if your partner decides to dump you for somebody else, that isn't like, it's not that the other person was wily and evil and your partner was this innocent victim. It's your partner made a decision and acted as a grown adult of their own volition. So I think that it might help for you to re-examine and rethink this immediate assumption that other people are a threat. Because even if you don't outwardly think that, the idea that like, okay, we're gonna save our marriage, just think about how you would apply that to discussions of any other relationship. Would you say overtly, we care about our marriage and we're preserving it over friendship, we're preserving it over family relationships? No, because you see family relationships as different. And even if you're going to be non-monogamous, the relationship that you're going to have with other people will be different than the relationship you have with your partner that you're married to. And any relationship they have will be different than the relationship that they have with you. So it's not really, it doesn't have to be this cutthroat, more or less. And I think that the way that monogamous-centric culture, and also just the way that people think about dating and love and as a resource that needs to be competed for, sometimes leads us into this type of thinking bleeding in. And I don't know is that it's necessarily accurate. So yeah, overall, if I can sum up, I think that as long as you're clear about what it is that, not only what it is that you are doing within non-monogamy, but also how other people fit into your relationship, that is ethical. You will always get people criticizing you for whatever choices you're going to make. If it works for you and your partner, and if you're not hurting loads of people, then I think that you're fine. I think as long as you're clear and upfront with anyone that you date about what position they would hold in your life and what non-monogamy means in your life, then they, as other grown adults, can decide to consent to that or leave if it doesn't fit them. And if they decide to consent to it and it isn't what they wanted and they get hurt, as much as that sucks, that's very different than a situation where you pretend like you're going to be emotionally involved in someone's life and you're not. And last but not least, I do think you should consider this kind of unspoken concept that other romantic relationships are a threat. And also think about the role that vetoes play within your relationship and, you know, how you treat other people. Because even if you have casual relationships, that doesn't mean you don't care about the people you have casual relationships, right? Like, you still don't want to hurt those people. And I think that it's worth talking about how you might go through challenges. And I think part of that will be establishing how non-monogamy works in your life, but also accepting the fact that you are going to feel challenged by this. It's a big change, and it's understandable to feel scared, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're bad at it or it's not the right decision. But how you all handle conflict is important. And to me, in my opinion, it's better for you if what you want is a long-term non-monogamous relationship and you're not just kind of testing the waters of non-monogamy. And if you are doing that, I think it's probably better to maybe just be honest again about that. But if you want a long-term non-monogamous relationship and you want that to work, I think it's better to work on the issues with each other whilst the relationship is open, because closing it will only temporarily solve the issue and it won't give you the practice that you need of addressing the problems that come up in your relationship whilst it's open. And it's also kind of not fair to the other people to just be chucked out like a defunct workcore. Anyways, so yeah, there's a lot going on in this. Hopefully that kind of gave you a thorough answer. And other people may disagree with me. Other people may be like, hierarchies are always wrong and evil and bad, blah, 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 whatever. I take a kind of an anarchical approach necessarily. I mean, I'm in a kind of in-between position where I'm not really necessarily sold on any type of relationship right now. But, you know, I kind of do have more of an anarchical approach. But I think that if a clear defined hierarchy works for you, then I think it's fine as long as people are informed about it and can say no to you. And they can say no if they know that it's something that you're doing, and if they don't want a part of it, then they can say no. But yeah, I hope that helps, and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 91 of Non-Monogamy Help. These next people that I'm about to talk about are awesome people. And they're awesome because they've donated $5 or more to the podcast, and they have allowed me to read their names. Laura Boylan, Chris Albury Jones, Juke Ellen Robertson, Nikki Jones, James Wartell, Leo Yaki, and Tyler Teepno. And if you want your name to be read at the end of the podcast, then all you have to do is give $5 or more and let me know that that's what you want. And it's a super awesome thing. It really helps me. Even $1 a month helps me. So shout out to my $1 a month patrons. Anyone giving any amount is just helpful. Like, the website hosting costs money, podcast hosting can cost money. Lots of things can cost money, and so anything you can help me towards making this into something that is sustainable is really helpful. But if you can't, if you don't have the money, I understand. One thing you can do to still, other than retweeting and sharing the podcast, is if you log on to iTunes, find the podcast, rate and review it. That's also another thing you can help. It helps me get the podcast out there to more people. And if you do write a review, then send me a screenshot on Twitter, because I don't get notifications if you write me a review. And I really appreciate it. Like, these reviews, they could honestly be so sweet and really touching. And I put this podcast out and I hope that it helps people, and hearing that it has helped people in any way is like really, really helpful and just really nice. If I'm having a really shit day, I do save some of the things to have a look at when I'm having a bad day. So I appreciate you. Thank you for listening. That's all this week. You'll get a new column next Friday and another podcast episode in a fortnight. Thank you again for listening and being awesome. Bye-bye. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. The music was done by Chris Albury Jones at albury-jones.com. Our podcast art was done by Dom Young at domduong.com. Thank you again for listening.